Okay, so I'm back. I wanted to do a part two. I've gotten so many questions on the small block Chevrolet heads. And you remember in the other video we talked about these earlier style heads. We got a set of 193s here that we just did for a customer. And so these were the typical 76cc chamber. They flowed pretty decent. They had the corner bolt valve covers and so forth on them. And so that's the earlier style head. But now I want to bring it up to date a little bit. Okay, a couple things that we need to talk about. Number one, I'm getting a lot of people asking, hey, which 350 heads should I put on my 305? Okay, let me say this loud and clear. Do not ever put 350 heads on a 305. Dumb, okay? And here's why. Number one, a 350 head that has 194 valves, which is the bigger intake valve, you can't put that on a 305 without the valves smashing into the engine block and bending. Because the 305 has a smaller cylinder bore and the big valves, they don't fit. You can put 350 heads on with the small valves in them, the truck heads, but here again, you're defeating the purpose. Because you have such a small volume in the cylinder, smaller cubic inches if you will, what happens when you put a big 76cc chamber on a 305 is your compression goes down to around 7-to-1. 305s don't run very good with higher compression. They're really going to run poorly with low compression. My advice to you, don't mess with a 305. I mean, that's, you know, I had a guy post and he says, hey, I got a 305 in my Camaro and it runs 12s and all this stuff. That's fine, but here's my point. If all things are equal, the 305 is not going to be able to keep up with the 350, right? So a 350 is actually less expensive to build than a 305, and it makes a lot more power. So personally, I don't mess with 305s. I think they're a complete waste of time. That motor was a dog, and you put money into a 305, you're wasting your time. Okay, so the other thing is, let's see, I got a list here. Okay, one guy writes in and he says, hey man, this is all opinion. Without the flow numbers, it's all opinion. Well, I responded to that, and hopefully everybody out there understands, I know what the flow numbers on these heads are because I've flow tested all of them. The stock Chevrolet heads all flow pretty much the same, with a few exceptions. There are some factory performance heads, I understand all that. Okay, so, but for the most part, they really don't flow that great. Some flow better than others, but they're all, you know, designed for stock applications for the most part. Okay, so now let's move up to my next point, and that is that what I see all the time is I see people say, they're talking about VORTEC heads. VORTEC, man, I gotta have VORTECs. Okay, well I agree, VORTEC heads are very good heads, but one of the big misconceptions out there is that a lot of people think they have VORTEC heads and they don't. The VORTEC head design was introduced in 1986 in the 4.3 liter V6 engine. It was not introduced to the small block Chevrolet 350s and 305s until 1996. All of the heads that were around up until that point were either on what we call a TBI engine or a TPI. Now TBI stands for throttle body injection. Throttle body injection, you've got basically a throttle body on top of your intake manifold, and there's a couple of injectors in it, or one injector, I'm not even sure. I think it's 2 injectors in there. And basically it's a glorified carburetor. These heads were not good performers. They actually had worse flow numbers than the earlier heads, okay? So there's a couple of differences between TPI, TBI, and VORTECs. Now VORTECs, we'll get to that a little later, those are the heads you really want to find because they do flow well. So the typical casting numbers that you're going to find out there, and TPI stands for tuned port injection. That's basically the multi-port fuel injection setup that's just a little bit better than TBI, but it still used crappy heads. So, you know, it's okay, but you above 4,800 to 5,000 RPMs, you're not going to flow any air. Just as simple as that. Okay, so 14102 191, 14102 193, 101 108 10, 1401 1081, and 1402 188. So basically 191s, 193s, 810s, 081s, and 188s. Now there are some differences in these. Some of them had different size chambers. This is a 350 head, had a 76 cc chamber. The 305s had smaller chambers. A couple of them were used, like this one here was used on the 305s and the 350s, so this bumped your compression up a little on your 350. You can pause the video and look at those numbers if you want, or you can do research on your own time. The point is, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the TBI heads other than to basically show you what the difference is. So on the TBI head, the throttle body injection, or the TPI head, one of the ways to identify these heads, and this is not a TBI head, okay, but it has the exact same bolt pattern. This is an aftermarket head made by RHS, but the bolt pattern is exactly the same as the TBI and the TPI. The intake manifold bolts are the main difference on these. So if we look at the intake manifold bolt pattern on the TBI, throttle body injection, or the TPI, tune port injection heads, which were made from 1986 through 95, what we find out is we have a bolt pattern that's very similar to the early small blocks. Now there is one exception. What they've done on these heads is they have taken these two center bolts here and they changed the angle of them. The angle is, they're angled up that way. Okay, so you'll put a bolt in here and these bolts will go straight in. When you get to these bolts, the bolt's going to be angled up this way. Because of this, it's difficult to put an early type intake manifold on the TBI or the TPI heads if you want to run a carburetor. But they do make, Professional Products and Edelbrock, they do make manifolds now that actually have the bolt holes in the intake changed. They changed the angle on the intake manifold, and you can buy a carbureted intake for the TPI and the TBI heads, okay? So basically the bolt pattern is the same with the exception of the angle on these two center bolts. The other difference is, now if you look on this head, you'll see that we have corner bolt valve covers, but this is an aftermarket head, so it has provisions for both. So the other thing about the TBI heads or the TPI heads, they're not going to have these corner bolt valve covers. They have bolt holes, and this head has dual pattern. So they actually have the bolt pattern in here where the valve covers have bolts going down the center of the valve covers. Okay, a lot of people automatically think, oh, it's a center bolt head, it's a VORTEC. No, it's not. It's not a VORTEC if it has this bolt pattern. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intake manifold bolt holes on each side. Okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So hopefully that makes sense, because there's a big difference between that and the VORTEC. So 6 bolts on the intake. The center two are angled differently than the early heads, but we still have 6 bolts on each side. Now, if we look at, now this is the early head, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? Now, the VORTEC heads, this is what you really need to understand about the VORTECs, is they were made from 1996 on up to into the 2000, 2006, 2007, somewhere in there until the LS motors came out. So the VORTEC heads are 96 and up, and they are not TBI or TPI heads. They are very different. So if we look at the VORTEC heads, these are the only 2 castings you're going to see for 350 VORTEC heads. They did make a 305 VORTEC, but they made a very, very limited number of those. In fact, when somebody has a 305 VORTEC that actually has a bad head, it's almost impossible to find a replacement head for that. Nobody's got them. So they just yank it out and put a 350 in there, which is what they should have done in the first place. All right, so the VORTEC heads, 1996 and up, you're going to see these 2 casting numbers, 10239 906, 1255862. These are the two castings, folks, that you are looking for. Okay, so we had somebody talk about flow numbers earlier, and they said, this is all conjecture. No, I know what the flow numbers are. It's not conjecture. These are the flow numbers basically that we're dealing with. So the TBI or the TBI heads, the best flow you're going to get out of those heads on average on the intake side, and that's what we're looking at. Now we're looking at, when we talk about flow, we're talking about CFMs, cubic feet per minute. We're talking about a cubic foot of air is 1 cubic foot of air. Okay? So when we flow test heads, we measure cubic feet of air per minute. How many cubic feet of air will that engine flow in 1 minute? The TBI heads and the TPI heads, basically the best you're going to get out of them is around 185 to 190 cubic feet of air per minute. The VORTEC heads, you're going to see right around 235 to 240 cubic feet of air per minute at their optimum flow lift, which is about 500 thousandths of an inch, about a ½ inch lift on the cam. These are going to flow 185 to 190, right around 400 lift, maybe 420 lift. So these actually flow much better at a higher lift. We've got, I don't know, probably 50 CFMs more flow from the VORTEC head than we do from any of the TBI heads. One of the things that this does is it makes this VORTEC head, now we've got a VORTEC head here, it makes these VORTEC heads excellent performers or an excellent choice. Now again, they're not going to flow as good as, this aftermarket RHS head with, really good chamber technology and gigantic intake runners. Okay, this set of heads here was over $1,000, and they flow right around 290, 295 CFMs on the intake side, which is, that's a street rod motor. That's a high performance or a race motor or whatever. The factory VORTEC heads, one of the things you'll notice right off is the chamber is different. If you look at the traditional 76cc chamber, and this is not a TBI head, but this is very similar to the TBI chamber. The TBI chamber will also have this spark plug boss here in it, but it will have a chamber that looks very much like this. Now, the VORTEC heads, if you look at these, what we've got is we've got what they call a heart-shaped chamber. This was a much more efficient, much more advanced chamber design. The technology was much better. We also have a very big intake runner, right, for a stock engine, which makes these flow really well. I showed you the flow numbers a minute ago. Now, one of the biggest differences on these is the intake bolt pattern. Remember, we counted the intake bolts on our other heads. We'll just come over here and do it again, just in case anybody misses this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intake bolts. The VORTEC, number one, it doesn't have a 3/8 intake bolt. It has a 5/16 bolt, and we got 1, 2, 3, 4. The true VORTEC heads are only going to have 4 intake bolts on each side. There is nothing in the middle here. There are no bolts. So we got a heart-shaped chamber. We got 2 bolts here, 2 bolts here on the intake side. The exhaust side looks very similar to the TBI head. And we have the heart-shaped chamber with big valves, of course. So that is your VORTEC head. These are excellent performers. Now, you say, well, what about the intake manifold? What if I want to put a carburetor on that? What if I want to stick these VORTEC heads? What if I want to upgrade my, 82 Camaro or my 72 Chevelle or whatever with VORTEC heads? That's actually a very excellent way to gain some power for a good price. You can get a decent set of VORTEC heads for probably $500 or $600. You really can't buy the RHS heads or the darts or any of those for that kind of money. So these are a really good upgrade over the early heads or especially the TBI heads or the TPI heads. And you can buy, ta-da, this is made by Professional Products, and I want you to notice how many intake bolts we have here. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're going straight down into the head rather than going in at an angle. And if you look at the intake bolts here, when this head is sitting on the motor, these bolts are going straight down in. So this is a manifold that was designed to go with VORTEC heads, and you can get a single plane, you can get a dual plane like this, you can get whatever. Edelbrock and Competition Products, and this one here is made by Power Plus Professional Products. You can get these manifolds from pretty much anybody. So if you want to upgrade to a VORTEC head, just make sure you're getting true VORTEC heads. What you will see all the time, and I see this all the time, you'll see an advertisement on Craigslist or eBay and it says VORTEC heads for sale. And you look at the heads and you start looking at the pictures of them and you look at the casting number, and they got 6 bolts here and they have one of these casting numbers here. Okay, those are not VORTEC heads. So hopefully that helps you understand what we talk about when we talk about VORTEC heads. If you have any questions, make sure that you email me, send me a message. You can also look me up on Facebook, My Vintage Iron 7512, and make sure you subscribe below. And so hopefully that helps. This is all based on you guys. You guys said, hey, what about the center bolt heads? What about the VORTECs? So I'm hoping that will clear up some of the confusion and keep you from making a big mistake, because a lot of people, either they don't know they don't have VORTEC heads, or they figure you won't know and they're trying to sell you TBI or TPI heads, call them VORTECs, when in reality they're not. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.